You ever get this sensation of derealization? The feeling that none of your experiences are real, that you're living in an elaborate illusion, that everything around you seems like a simulation or a performance of some sort, that everything seems flat and repetitive, especially during the pandemic, like you're living in a version of Groundhog Day meets The Truman Show? Well, you're not alone in that. What you're feeling is derealization, and I too am feeling that. When you watch the news, it just seems too bizarre to be real. Like the late night comedians and the farcical comedy shows are just like running out of material. Politics feels like it's a theatrical production, and all the people who are in charge are acting like cartoon villains, ignoring obvious atrocities and injustices, and just kind of ignoring the whole climate change thing and pushing us ever towards climate disaster. And obviously they're not acting in your best interests. There's a cynicism that comes along with what they're doing, and it seems obvious to me, it seems obvious to you, but yet people are still voting for them for some reason. There's people that are still supporting them. Do they not see it? Do they not get it? Do they not understand? What's going on here? Meanwhile, they're all making references to, like, the economy, whatever that is, and it seems like some sort of sorcery. They put numbers in here and they take numbers out there, and out of thin air they're creating more money, and then money disappears again, and how does that work? And all the while there's this weird algorithm thing, and it keeps showing you stuff, and obviously it's spying on you, and feels like it's out to drive you nuts, or like confuse you or something like that. It's almost enough to drive one to paranoia, to make one think that one's going utterly insane. Are the conspiracy theorists right? Is there really a cabal of secret evil people? Or is this even real life? Am I even real? Am I just a brain in a jar? Well, I got good news and I got bad news. The good news is you're not actually going crazy. Probably. The bad news is, well, everything else is. The rest of the world is actually as crazy as it seems. Yeah, and all this, reality, none of it's strictly real. Thing is, your perception of reality is necessarily a delusion. You've got limited senses and limited sensation, and really limited reach in terms of what you can directly sense. Take, for instance, Exhibit A. What color is this? Well, you're thinking, of course, it's orange. But no, you're wrong. It's not orange at all. It's actually a whole bunch of little red dots and a couple of green dots that is tricking the color receptors in your eyes into tricking your brain into thinking that it's the color orange. And similarly, if you look at a sunset that appears to be orange, there's not actually any orange in it at all. There's the color of yellow, which is the color of nitrogen, and there's the oxygen, which is pink. And when they mix together, you end up with orange in your brain when there's no orange out there. Or take, for example, Exhibit B. This duck rabbit thing, which if you look at it in one way looks like a duck, and the other way it looks like a rabbit. And you can, if you concentrate, you can make it change. Duck, rabbit, duck, rabbit.
Duck season! Duck season!
But if you didn't know what a duck was, and you didn't know what a rabbit was, what would it look like at all? Would it look like anything? Your mind is doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes in this. It's filling in all the gaps in your senses, your very limited senses, with all this narrative information. By knowing what a duck is and knowing what a rabbit is, you're able to add that to this sensory information that you're getting. You're not actually seeing a duck or a rabbit, but you're seeing the idea of a duck, or the idea of a rabbit, the idea of orange. You can't really access reality as it is. You have no ability to sense things the way that they are. All you've got is these senses that you're set with. So you have to make something up in order to make sense of the world. And at its basic level, this worldview, this reality that's generated for you, is generated by narrative, stories. These stories can be very simple. They can just be autobiographical. They can tell you about the story of your life. They can tell you about the story of what you did today. But by telling these stories, you're able to make sense of your experiences, make sense of the way that you view the world, that you're experiencing the world. If you didn't know anything about the world, if you hadn't heard any stories about the world, then you'd have no way of really making sense of the world. So you need those stories. You need some sort of a narrative to fill in the gaps that make sense of your senses. For most people, the basic set of reality-shaping narratives happen during childhood. It's the folklore that you inherit. It's the stories you're told by your parents. It's the very language that you inherit from this culture that shapes the way that you think about the world. With a different language or a different set of cultural norms, well, you'd think about things very differently. You would sense not a duck or a rabbit, but something else perhaps. These worldview-shaping narratives aren't just a set of facts or information, but they're actually the foundation on which your reality is built. So any fact or information that you happen to learn has to be built on top of these basic assumptions about reality. These can include our values, what we consider to be worthwhile, our ways of seeing the world, the cosmology, what the universe looks like, what our place in the universe is, what we as human beings really even are. There's no such thing as an objective view of reality. We all have unique perspectives on the world, unique ways of seeing the world and perceiving and understanding and making sense of the world. And all the meanings that we attach to our senses of the world, well, they're constructions. They're constructions of our own mind, but they're also constructions based on the information, the narratives that we've received from our culture. And since all meaning is constructed, well, whoever has access to control these narratives, whoever sets this narrative for a society, is in control of reality. When we enter the world, we know nothing. We have no way of making sense of our senses, we have no knowledge of history or context, we don't even know that we are a subject, that we exist. As Martin Heidegger might describe it, we're thrown into the world, whether or not we want to be. We have no knowledge or control over our history or our condition or the world at large or its past or anything else like that. And our understanding of the world is set by socialization and the material conditions that we grow up with. Our parents and our school and the media, our peers, and all their experiences serve to shape our selfness as we age and grow into maturity. But hang on a second here. Where did our parents and the school and everything else, where did they get their reality? Where are those narratives coming from? Well, they got it from their parents and their school and their past. Each successive generation is thrown into the world the same way, and each time we don't have any knowledge of what came before us. So really, each generation forgets the one before it. All the generational memory that accumulates slowly ebbs away into the past as people die, pass on, and the generation after it starts to take its place. Over time, this generational memory starts to lose its resolution. It stops being personally relevant or even relevant to your family or your community, and eventually starts being this abstract story that you have no real connection to. And past that point, it becomes pretty easy to manipulate that story. The truth is, most of what we know about history, most of the stories we've heard in school is kind of a fake. It's kind of been made up. Part of it's propaganda in order to make us feel comfortable about the colonial past of our society. Part of it's the product of material conditions as well. Part of it's also just like the way people remember things. We don't really like remembering things a certain way, things that make us uncomfortable. We prefer to think of it with rose-colored glasses. Or for that matter, there are some other things that we fixate on the negative for, and that influences the very way that we see the rest of the world, even if it's completely unrelated. For that matter, there's even fake stories about the present, the way that things are right now that shape the way that we see the world is right now. Whose worldview is this? Where are we getting this information? Who's telling these stories, and where did they come from? Well, the answer to this question is, who benefits from this worldview? For as long as there's been civilization, there's been a ruling class of civilization. And, well, it's their worldview that we've inherited. This is what Antonio Gramsci refers to as cultural hegemony. By definition, an elite ruling class is, well, elite, which means that there's not many of them. So how do they then protect their power? If the non-elite people, if everybody else were to exercise the agency they have, exercise the power that they have as individuals, well, the elites wouldn't stand a chance. So the elites need some way of curtailing the agency of the masses. Another way to describe the curtailing of agency is to exercise power. Now, there's lots of different forms of power. The pre-modern and most straightforward way to exercise power is, well, just threaten to beat up anybody that threatens your power. So this could work if you're a big strong dude and you're able to beat up a lot of people, but if your community grows to a certain size, well, you might need to start paying people to beat people up for you. So that could work for a while. But then once it gets to a certain other size, well, it's going to require a lot of overhead. There will be a lot of people needed to threaten to beat people up. So, well, you can use a show of public force. You can do public executions and floggings and torture and things like that. And that will scare people into submission because, well, they don't want to be flogged or executed or beaten or whatever else. And this works for a certain extent, but past a certain point it just doesn't work all that well. So instead of just exercising purely martial power of the sovereign, why not exercise control over narrative? If you generate a narrative that creates a worldview in which power is divinely ordained, well, people won't rise up against you because, well, you don't want to go against the will of God now, do you? This certainly works for a superstitious people, for somebody that might believe in such a narrative. If one's worldview includes the supernatural, mysticism, then yeah, maybe the divine right of kings, the hereditary power of the sovereign, that might work for civilization. But then what happens when rationalism comes along? Well, we can turn rationalism to this cause as well. If we just rationally make this set of people, say like white man, be the superior dominant race, well, there's a way that we can maintain power as well. And of course, there's other non-racial, non-gender-based ways of using rationality to exercise power. There's a long history of it, and you can see the results of that all over the world. The divine right of our age is, well, the economy. Anything that angers the economy is not good, so we shouldn't do that thing. But anything that pleases the economy, well, we need to do that. We need to vote for the leader that is good for the economy, because the economy is, well, it's God. But how did it get that way? Why do we worship the economy? Why did they worship kings of old? Well, this is the reification process. It's how a thing becomes a thing. First, a narrative is generated to create a thing, to generate an idea of a thing. And then we, by this generational memory loss, we forget that we created that thing. We forget that we're the authors of the economy or anything else like that, and then it starts to have power over us. We're no longer in charge of that thing that we've created, even though we created it, just because we can't remember it. Because now it blends into the normal. Now it blends into common sense. Now it blends into rationality. This is what Gramsci's talking about when he's talking about cultural hegemony. It creeps into science. It creeps into psychology and our way of thinking about how we think, and creeps into sociology, creeps into history. Our very idea, our knowledge of history is influenced by this hegemonic way of looking at the world, the stories that we've been told that instill this cultural hegemony upon us. This even informs our philosophy, our values, our ethics, our norms, our notions of what human nature is. What even is? What is it to be? Without knowing any other sort of world, it feels like this is the way that it always was. But it wasn't. And it feels like it's objective, but it isn't. And it feels like common sense, but it ain't. But obviously as human beings, we're not homogenous. We're not oblivious, we're not blind, we're not unthinking robots. We may be born into this world, we might not have control over our history or our culture, but it's not strictly deterministic. We do have some choice. We can learn things. We can notice stuff. We have a drive to exercise agency over the world. We want to exercise control over our lives and our destinies. There's no such thing as a sheeple, as much as the conspiracy theorists might want to think that there is. This is a problem for the people that hold that hegemonic power. So how do they compensate for it? How do they deal with the fact that people are sometimes critically thinking beings? Well, they need new ways of exercising power. Of course, the old ways of using power still exist. They still work. You can still threaten to beat people up. You can still execute people who go against you. But more modern forms of power involve disciplinary power. Michel Foucault is a major thinker in this respect, describing the rise of the disciplinary society. Using systems and structures and surveillance and the design of spaces, it's possible to elicit a certain type of behavior and a certain type of thinking that's not obvious, not overt, but definitely effective. This phenomenon is most obvious in, like, the military, or prison, or some other sort of highly regimented environment. By controlling every aspect of life, by controlling the timetable, when you sleep, when you eat, where you go, what you say, what you think, what you do, it's possible to elicit a form of behavior that's compliant. The individual is able to be afforded a certain amount of freedom. They're not just constantly locked in a cage. They can do certain things, but based on this disciplinary power always in the back of the mind and always being surveilled, a behavior is elicited that seems to be free, but isn't. And this applies outside the institution as well. Our everyday life is full of this sort of disciplinary power. We live by a common clock. We have to go to work at this time. We have to go do these things. We have certain rituals that always get followed. And this allows us to operate smoothly in society, but it also allows us to behave ourselves without the overt power of the state or whatever powerful entity overtly oppressing us or threatening us. The institutions of church and school and work and all those other sorts of things have this influence on us that change our behavior subtly so that social pressures rather than overt physical pressures are actually influencing our behavior. One of Foucault's other interests is in madness, as in mental illness, where the symptomatology of mental illness is a way of disciplining people into a certain form of behavior. And if you're not able to keep up, if you're not able to make it in the society, well, you've got the symptoms of mental illness now, don't you? And here, have these drugs, and here, have these treatments until we can get you back to work, so that we can get you acting like everybody else. But this also enters the intellectual realm. The knowledge power that's exerted over our consciousness makes it so that we can only really think of or imagine or discuss certain realms of things. We have no real capacity to think outside these bounds, even if we wanted to, even if we knew we could. This disciplinary form of power is still quite obvious in this day and age, but the world's just a bit too complicated for it to work completely. The mass media, the availability of democratized education, free thought, the whole democratic apparatus kind of undermines the ability to complete this illusion, to keep people in closed environments. Because yes, it's easy enough to keep a prisoner under control by disciplining their days and weeks, but how do you do that when we have freedom? When we can walk around wherever we want, when we can associate with whomever we want, when we can learn whatever we want, when we can go on the internet and talk and learn and do whatever? Well, this is cause for a new paradigm of ways to control people's agency, what Gilles Deleuze calls the society of control. It's a more flexible but perpetually evolving inscribed form of freedom that still feels free and indeed is extremely free, but the bounds of which this freedom is made in pretty tightly controlled. And the effect of this is the transmutation of agency into choice. There's a difference between agency and choice. Agency is your exercise of will. It's what you actually are choosing to do. It's what you intend under completely free conditions. Whereas choice, on the other hand, well, you're choosing from options. You're choosing from within a limited range of possibilities. As much as we might think of ourselves as individuals, free individuals who can do whatever we want, look whatever we want, know whatever we want, say whatever we want, there are limits in what we can do. Our choice of fashion, for example, is not necessarily completely free. We still have to choose from limited style options. Whatever's in style this season is what you can choose to wear. And if you're wearing something that's out of fashion, well, that's a fashion statement in itself. You might face social censure if you wear something that's completely outside the norm, or that might be a statement of some sort that you might be trying to communicate. One way or the other, regardless of what you choose, you're still choosing. The whole consumerist paradigm is laid out in the same way. The choice of brand loyalty. Do you like the red carbonated soda or the blue carbonated soda? Are you an Apple person or an Android person? Do you identify with this form of commodified entertainment or that form of commodified entertainment? Are you a Jedi or a Sith? You've got choices, sure, but you're not really free outside of these options. Rather than a naturalistic and local culture, we're presented with this celebrity culture that we worship as royals and gossip about around the water cooler, and we're provided with an endless stream of diversions and distractions, from video games to TV shows to movies to things to consume. And I'm not judging people for doing this, because of course you want entertainment. You've got a hard life to live. This world is not pleasant to be in. So of course there's going to be a demand for this sort of entertainment that diverts and distracts you from the unpleasantness of the world. The Frankfurt School, particularly Adorno and Horkheimer, talk about this as the culture industry. Effectively what this is a method by which to rob people of their agency by providing them with exactly what they want. By providing you with exactly what will comfort you in your moment of fatigue and frustration and anger about the state of the world, well, it's pacifying. It's going to be able to ease you into going back to work again tomorrow, ease you through the knowledge that the world is collapsing around you, get you just basically through the day. And since there's so many options, so much choice available to you, it gives you this illusion that you're in control, that you've had agency. But that illusion of agency actually robs you of your actual agency. The theatrical nature of modern politics is a perfect example of this. Quoting Noam Chomsky, "The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable discourse, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum." In the American context, the Republicans and the Democrats, well, most of their political positions are basically identical. Sure, their social positions are a bit different, and maybe the Democrats are a little bit nicer about their foreign imperialism and brutal free market capitalist economics, but they do a lot the same. But nonetheless, you turn on the TV, you watch the debates, you watch the impeachment, you watch all the nonsense on the television, and it seems like there's a war going on. And indeed, it produces a war within the spirit of the American people. The events of the last few months is evidence of this, that the nation is now more divided than it's ever been, but there's nobody really on the other side. It's mostly just for show. Well, in the energy, the excitement, the spectacularness of this spectacle, it draws our attention. It causes us to stare at this thing, whether we want to or not. And we have a psychological vulnerability in our minds that things that we hear about more often, we tend to like more. We tend to accept them more because, well, they're familiar. The familiarity bias is how we ended up with Donald Trump. He ended up with most of the news time, and so he ends up with most of the votes, regardless of how capable a president he was or wasn't. We're particularly vulnerable to these spectacles, to these entertainment products, because we are a degraded people. We've been reduced into consumers and workers and commodities of our own that has reduced our ability to exercise agency in our lives. We may have the option to choose, but we don't have the option to choose just as we'd like. And there's a great deal wrong in our society. It's not pleasant to be in. And this degradation has hollowed us out. Our sense of meaning and agency is reduced to damn near nothing. And as such, this spectacle provides itself an enticing alternative, really. In the society of the spectacle, commodities become the narrative symbols that we generate our worldview with. The Coke, the Pepsi, the Jedi, the Sith, these are the things that generate our cultural reality. Rather than a robust sense of individuality, we're transformed into an amalgamation of commodities, things that we can purchase to make up what makes up us. And this generates the illusion of agency by generating the illusion of choice without providing any actual agency at all. And with so many of us flattened out in this way, turned into one-dimensional people, we become what's known as a dividual, rather than an individual with actual hopes and dreams and desires and a personality. We can be managed, not as people, but as units, as numbers, as statistics, as flows, as part of an economic unit. And by this same method, resistance itself can be turned into yet another countercultural commodity. Rather than meaningful political resistance, political thought, political discourse, it just turns into boycotts and boycotts and pussy hats and Che Guevara t-shirts. It's an effective strategy at de-radicalizing mass resistance, but still doesn't quench that thirst for agency. To have meaningful agency, we need to understand the world. And since our method of understanding is through this narrative, since we're stuck as individuals rather than individuals, there's this systemic undermining of our level of shared meaning, shared understanding of the world. So we live in different worlds entirely. It's impossible to collaborate, to get together, to resist meaningfully if we live in different worlds. The postmodern movement attempted to reject grand narratives and of the idea of ideology in the first place, but this just had the effect of undermining the last remaining ground on which we could stand together. In other words, this has led to total nihilism. Nothing means anything forever. This is what I think is causing this sense of unreality. It's too obvious to miss that something is amiss, and so as such it requires an increasingly elaborate degree of mental pretzeling just to even pretend to be okay. This might involve anesthetics, drugs, that kind of thing, and yeah, consuming those cultural products that are oh so entertaining. But this can also feed an inappropriate drive to gain a sense of agency. But instead of actual agency, what this compulsion is a need to gain control. And methods of gaining control can be pretty toxic. Could manifest in trying to control your partner, or your child, or other family members, or could turn into trying to control yourself through obsessive health control or eating control, the attempt to maximize consumption of certain products to feel like the best Star Wars fan in the world, or for that matter, it could lead to falling into anxiety and depression when you can't actually gain that sense of control that you actually want. And since it's control that you're trying to gain and not actual agency, it's never actually satiable. You will always want more control, even if you have it. And this is effectively an individualization of a societal systemic problem. Rather than viewing it as the systemic problem that it is, the person who's suffering these symptoms is subject to, well, psychiatry. Here, take these pills, have some anesthetics, they'll make you feel better. The flip side of this coin, though, is, well, unhealthy delusions. Between the conspiracy fantasists, the people with blame narratives, the folks that think that there's a powerful cabal of people who have their fingers in everything, and, usually if you dig hard enough, it's the Jews. Or people that fall into total cynicism, that can't believe that anybody actually means well, or could turn into destructive impulses. People who want people to hate them, people that just want to watch the world burn, people who fall into cults, populism, who follow authoritarian dictators who might give them some sense for reality, some sense for a narrative that actually makes sense. Or whenever the fuck goop is, some self-help, some self-improvement nonsense that basically is a cult in its own right. The lack of a shared reality that comes along with a narrative vacuum drives these folks to cling on to any narrative that might give them some sense for explanatory power, anything that might give them a sense of power and agency over the world that they otherwise can't attain. And yes, this uncertainty can be weaponized in their drive to know something, to be in the know in order to feel a sense of agency. Really, they're willing to grab onto anything. You could sell them any bill of goods, whether it be a dictator or a prophet or anything else like that, and people will buy it. This sort of thinking, from conspiracy theorists to mystical narratives to anything else like that, draws any criticism of the world, any critical inquiry, into a cul-de-sac. Rather than looking further, rather than continuing to investigate what's wrong with the world, the people that fall into this strategy just land on something. Rather than a quest for knowledge, it turns into a quest for certainty. And once they've got something they can be certain of, it's hard to let that go. And by this path, even radical resistance to the status quo, even the people that are willing to take up arms against it, they're recouped right back into the system as it exists. By barking up the wrong tree, it's impossible to actually mount any meaningful resistance. And in this realm, the complexity and the aesthetic elegance of the narrative stands in for the veracity of that worldview. The more complicated, the more elegant, the more interesting, the more entertaining the narrative, the more correct it seems, regardless of any other evidence. So how the hell do we get out of here? The situation seems intractable. Most, myself included, are confused and frustrated and anxious and depressed and numb and tired all the time. And it seems obvious to us that something is wrong, that this whole thing is bonkers, but it seems like everybody else is just kind of going along with it. Am I the crazy one? Are you the crazy one? Well, no, we're not crazy. The world is as crazy as it seems. The thing is, the conspiracy fans aren't totally wrong. They might have the wrong target, but the idea is correct. See, there is actually a group of elites who are in control of everything. But it's not like the Illuminati. It's not some cabal of shadowy figures, not lizard people. It's rich people. It's just rich people. We live in a world where everybody votes with their dollar, and the people with more dollars, well, they get more votes. Obviously. It's not a secret. It's not very complicated. It's downright obvious. It's obvious what's going on here, and I don't think it requires any sort of complex narrative or conspiracy theory to explain it. It's just there are powerful people in powerful positions with a lot of power who have a vested interest in keeping that power, and so they would like our world to be such that we cannot rise up against them. But even that's not completely accurate because, well, it's not just the rich people that are at fault. If we took the 1,000 or even 10,000 richest people in the world and just lined them up and shot them, nothing would really change. The system would hiccup and it would lurch a little bit, but it would probably continue on exactly as it is, because it's actually the system that has the most influence here. Even these rich people, even these elites, the people that seem to be with the levers of power, well, they have limited agency of their own. They have shareholder profits to protect. They have to make certain economic decisions that please the market. Ah, we're back there. The funhouse of mirrors that we find ourselves in has this self-perpetuating quality to it. All the economic logic, all the impetus to maximize money creation, the rendering of all else, including nature, including human happiness, as externalities to the economic equation, well, this limits what we can actually do. Even the most well-meaning CEOs still have to follow these same rules. And if the rules are toxic, if the game's rules are toxic, well, you're going to end up with a toxic result. And at this point, we're kind of on a terminal trajectory. It's a little scary. So, what the hell do we do about it? Well, obviously, I don't have any easy, straightforward answers. That would be just too simple. But since this problem was created and maintained by hegemonic power, why not start there? And yes, this problem needs to be solved on a global scale, but we don't really have access as individuals to the global scale. All we really have access to is us as individuals, and our families, and our homes, and our communities. So the path forward involves clearing ourselves of this hegemonic worldview. If our minds have been colonized by this imperialistic, capitalistic, nationalistic, anti-humanistic worldview, well, let's decolonize. Let's kick the settlers out. In other words, the revolution is therapy. Therapy is the revolution. Ontological therapy. We need to change our worldview on an individual level and then on a societal level so that we can look at the world in a way that is healthy, that can encourage us and help us make healthy choices, take healthy actions towards one another. The key to this is recognizing that all meanings, everything that means, is made. There are no natural meanings out in the world. It's all something that was human created. Money isn't a natural category. We made money. Capitalism is not a natural category. Capitalism is something that was invented by people. And then we forgot about capitalism. We forgot about the influence that it has. We forgot about the ramifications and the way that it influences our lives. And then it held power over us. It can stop holding power over us. We just have to choose it. If a worldview has been learned, it can be unlearned. We can choose to learn new worldviews. But we need to be careful not to leave a vacuum, because meaninglessness has its own problems. Nihilism is a terrifying thing, and that grants no additional agency from what we have now. Friedrich Nietzsche was particularly freaked out about the idea of nihilism, that there is no more culturally constructed meaning from religious narratives. During his age, it was the rise of rationalism, so none of these existing traditional forms of meaning meant anything anymore. And so he feared basically what we're experiencing now, this funhouse where nothing means anything, which means we can't exercise agency at all. We have no power left. And yet we're clinging so desperately to some measure of power, some measure of meaning, that we're getting in our own way. Nietzsche describes 3 stages of this personal transformation to get away from the meanings that are constructed for us by this funhouse society and towards freedom, real freedom. The first stage is the camel, where the individual really recognizes that something's up, something's amiss. You, the viewer, you're there right now at the very least. You've recognized that something is up, something is wrong here, and, well, you're not quite perhaps prepared to do something about it yet. It's not easy to do something. It's not easy to know what to do, if there is anything to do at all. And so you carry on, like the camel. You revel in your own strength. You're able to bear this burden. You know everything is bullshit, but you're able to get through it. You can get to work. You can do the thing. But eventually that stops holding any sort of power. It's not possible to continue that way. Eventually the camel has to lay his burden down. At this stage, there is the sacred no. We've decided, no, we're not going to take this anymore. We know it's bullshit, and we reject all that. We are going to find a way beyond meaning. We're going to reject the meanings of this existing society. This is where the danger of nihilism comes in, though. If we start to reject the meanings that we're given, but we don't have any new meanings to have, well, we can easily get lost. We can get stuck in a place where nothing matters and nothing ever changes. And I feel like that's where I'm at right about now. But the next phase, the child stage, well, that's where the real transformation occurs. That's when we're free. We're free of these old meanings. They don't hold sway over us, but also we're not reacting against them. We're not fighting against the existing meanings that we've rejected. We're playing among them. We're free to make our own meanings and create our own world without regard for what came before us or what has to come after us. This is where I think we can really reach if we work at it. If we take the time to self-inspect and to think deeply about the world and to criticize and critique what comes around us. The future is the child. The philosopher of the future is childlike wonder. And so may we all become children. May we all embrace this postmodern philosophy and help to bring about the new world, not only in our own lives, but once we ourselves are transformed, help to transform others, help to transform the world around us. It's not going to be an easy project. This isn't a trivial task. We're probably not going to make it, but we have to try. Otherwise, we're consigned to death. And this is the core reason for my philosophical project here. I want to heal myself, for one, but I also don't want to live on a world that's dying. I want to see a tomorrow that's worth living for, something that I can be optimistic about, something I can feel hopeful for. The odds are going to be long, and I'm not too hopeful yet, but I think we might have a chance here. If we work together, if we start working together as individuals, rather than some abstract individual entity, I think we can actually change things about this world. So, thanks for watching. I do these videos daily, and so if you like this content, I'd appreciate the help in trying to spread it. If you could like the video and share it and subscribe to the channel, I'd really appreciate it, because this is a labor of love. This is basically the thesis, my master's thesis on the wall behind me. This is basically what I'm doing here, and I want to continue this project. So tune back in later for more videos. I'll see you tomorrow.